All right, so we start today with a very interesting, I think, section on Milton Friedman's The Methodology of Positive Economics from 1953. The outline is this: first some literature, then I present Friedman's article, but I'm going to rush through it because I suppose that you've read it, hopefully. Otherwise, you can do that afterwards. And then I come to the comments on Friedman, and that will take much longer. So it's the central text of section 5. Well, there you can see it where it's reprinted. And supplementary text, there's a comparatively new book on Friedman. And on chapter 10 of that book, Forder also treats methodology. So, of course, this is the article. Then Horsman, we met him already. He's one of the best-known philosophers of economics. Why Look Under the Hood? That's a strange title, but he speaks about F53 as well. Then an article of mine that is from 21, but still in press, revisiting Friedman's The Methodology in Methodus, which is not the very best journal in the world, but has other reasons. And then there is a collection of articles from 2009 from Mäki. Mäki is also one of the leading figures, a Finnish philosopher of economics, and he's written 2 articles there and earlier articles on F53, and then a fairly well-known article by Alan Musgrave, an Australian, New Zealand philosopher, Unreal Assumptions in Economic Theory, the F-twist untwisted. Isn't that nice? Okay. Now, something now on the article itself. Now, Milton Friedman, every one of you should know them. A leading figure of the 20th century. Some people say he's the leading economist in the second half of the 20th century. Nobel Memorial Prize 76, 250,000 Google citations, which is a lot also in economics. The most important publications, Capitalism and Freedom, 26,000 Google citations, and of course this one, infamous article, The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits. So this is a slap in the face of everyone who thinks, no, there's a moral obligation, and Friedman says, yes, the social responsibility is its profits. 25,000 citations. Of course, the wind has shifted somewhat. So today, people, as far as I can see in the literature, say, no, businesses have more responsibility. So it's not only the stakeholders, but also not only the shareholders, but also the stakeholders. So this has changed. But still, some people, of course, support this view. So it's an interesting development that happened here in the business world. And then the methodology is often called F53. It's generally seen as the most important methodological article in post-war economics, 7,900 Google citations in February. So this is a centerpiece, and whenever you look in the internet, classes on philosophy of economics, you find typically a section on this article. It's highly disputed. The standard view of F53 is this, and there are people then support that or attack it. It's called Friedman's instrumentalism, and here is in the words of Mäki, he says that's the standard view, what the message of this article is. Even outrageously unrealistic assumptions are just fine insofar as the theory or model involving them performs well in predicting phenomena of interest. So that's instrumentalism, and generally, I think I haven't counted them. So in many discussions, both in philosophy of economics, but also other people who know of Friedman, that's the instrumentalist position. Period. And this is just the standard view, and we will see whether that's a correct view. And instrumentalism, just to define that here quickly, it means that hypotheses are just instruments to produce predictions, not truthful representations of reality. I'm going to say more about that, but this is just the basic idea. That's instrumentalism. You say all the hypotheses and theories, what we have, we should see them as instruments, not just looking what they say, but they are just instrument to produce predictions, right? And all I'm interested in is the prediction that this instrument delivers. And I'm not interested more in that instrument, in that thing that delivers the predictions. So that's the idea. And the idea is then that Friedman defended that and said the assumptions may be outrageously unrealistic. It doesn't count. No one asks in economics, or should ask, whether they are realistic or not. That's not the point. Only ask whether it produces predictions that are good. Okay, so that's the stereotype. It is a stereotype, and we'll see whether that's a good stereotype or not. So among methodologists and philosophers of economics, F53 is highly contested until today. Still there are papers appearing, as you saw in the 21 paper there that I mentioned, which is amazing. I mean, this is 70 years ago, so it's amazing that it's still discussed. Yes. That many different interpretations exist, especially concerning instrumentalism versus realism and the relation of F53 to Popper, and you find really diametrically opposing views on that, which is strange because, I mean, it's a paper of 30 something pages, and one should find out what's in there. Well, that's naive, obviously. Okay, the outline of the article is this. So the structure, first relation positive and normative economics, then on positive economics, then the question, can a hypothesis be tested by the realism of its assumptions? Then the significance and role of the assumptions of a theory, some implications for economic issues and conclusions. These are the subtitles of the paper, and I'm just rushing through the paper now. First, he starts with the relation between positive and normative economics. I mentioned that topic already in the second or third lecture, and what he claims there, that the results of positive economics are often rejected because they don't fit ideas about normative economics. But, that is what his rejoinder, but positive economics is independent of any ethical position. So this was the discussion we had earlier in the class, where I said what the relation between positive and normative economics is, and he defends, of course, the value-free ideal for positive economics. So he says positive economics cannot be wrong for ethical or moral reasons because it doesn't involve these values. It just describes what's the case. If you dislike what it describes, then don't criticize positive economics, but criticize the economy that's having these facts. The task is a system of generalizations to make correct predictions about the consequences of any change in circumstances. And that, of course, means any change in circumstances, of course, political interventions. This is the political use then of economics, and positive economics tells you if you change this one, then this will happen, and then you have to decide whether you like that or not. And he thinks that positive economics is an objective science as the physical sciences. Normative economics and the art of economics depend on it. Now here the term art of economics appears. That has somehow disappeared from economics today, but in the late 19th century this was still quite common. People spoke about positive economics, normative economics, and the art of economics. And the art of economics is, of course, economic policy, of applying economic insights for political purposes. So normative economics and the art depend on positive economics. And then he claims that the differences about economic policy derive mostly from different predictions, not from different values. And that is, I think, an extremely important idea. Examples, for instance, when people have different opinions about minimum wage, about trade unions, and wait a minute, I got to go back here. Now, what he says is when people have different opinions about minimum wage, it looks as if there were moral considerations. So some people care about low-income people and other people don't care. And those people who care about low-income people, they say, oh, we have to have a minimum wage. So it looks like a moral conflict. And what Friedman says, no, it's very often not a moral conflict. It's a conflict about assumptions, how the economy works. And I think this is a fundamentally important distinction, not only for economics, but really for your own life, if you wish. I can tell you from my life, well, 40 years ago or 50 years ago, 40 years ago, the majority of people were pro-nuclear power. what's called peaceful, the peaceful use of atoms. So it was an absolute consensus. And those people who started in the early 70s to oppose nuclear power in the name of environmental issues and so on, there were the radicals. And there were really, there were the left-wing radicals, Green parties formed a little later, that all started in the 70s. And I was at that time a little younger than today, as you can imagine, and I was skeptical about nuclear power, not because of accidents. I thought, wrongly, as I know now, that normal accidents won't happen because engineers can do that, they can manage it. Well, it turned out that they obviously can't really. So I was really troubled about nuclear waste, because that's the obligation, the commitment that you have then for 10,000s of years to look after that damn waste, and that's dangerous. And I thought this is not so good. So I was there against, softly against, not in a radical way, against nuclear energy. And I remember very well when I was in a discussion, and then a physicist who defended nuclear energy, he then asked, do you think, not me, he asked someone else, do you really think I do not care about my children? And that really hit me like a shock, because in this very moment I realized, well, I assumed he didn't, right? Because I thought that people defending nuclear energy were really immoral, right? So, but the point is, if you speak about, say, the normative evaluation of nuclear energy, of course you make assumptions. For instance, assumptions what will happen to nuclear waste. And if you are a technological optimist, you may say, yes, we don't have a solution now, but that solution will come in the next 20, 30, 40, whatever years, right? And that is an assumption on a purely theoretical level, right? Not on a moral level. And if you are there pessimist technologically, then you say, oh, we'll have that nuclear waste then for centuries and thousands of years, and that's morally not responsible to do that. But the point is that what looks like a moral difference, really, and an important one, especially when you're young and then you are really convinced of your moral ideals and say, this is the right way, I want to live in a better world, then you judge, me included, and then you judge other positions according to their moral stance, and then it may be that what is in truth a difference about positive facts, right, about hypotheses, how things will develop, you see them as moral differences, and partly they are not, right? The same happened then 10 or 20 years later with the Pershing rockets when they were placed in Germany and other European countries. Then the peace movement found that absolutely negative for moral reasons, of course. But the point is, what is behind is the question about positive stuff, about facts or presumed facts, whether that's a good way to contain the Soviet Union, right? And that's nothing moral. That's a question where military people and strategic people have to think. So the point is what Friedman is saying here and stressing is a very important point in our political life, not only in economics, that whenever we have differences with moral value, that you think, well, I'm doing the right thing to live in a better world, and the others apparently do not do that. And then one ascribes to them a lower moral status, and to oneself, of course, a higher moral status, of course. But the difference may be another one. It may be the difference may be somewhere else. And this is what Friedman claims. I cannot judge that really judge that what he says there about the situation in the 40s and 50s. I mean, this is what he is referring to. But it's highly plausible to me that very often that such different opinions about minimum wage, trade unions, etc., which look like moral differences, are in fact differences about presumed facts and hypotheses. And that what he says, then possible consensus on economic policy thus depends much more on progress of positive economics than on progress of normative economics. I think that we human beings in the more or less the same culture, we have not so strong normative or moral differences, but we do have many differences concerning our hypothesis how the world works. And many of the political and intergenerational and so on differences are really differences about assumptions how the world works, and less really normative differences. Of course, when it comes to religion, it becomes different, but about normal political things, so to speak. Okay, so this is that is, I think, a very important thing that Friedman stresses here. And now he then speaks next about positive economics. So for Friedman, positive economics is also concerning policy issues, more important than normative economics, right? For the reason that I gave you. So he said that the ultimate goal of a science is a theory that yields predictions about phenomena not yet observed. This is a cliche that you hear from natural scientists. So physicists, for instance, I heard it in talks, in discussions, something is only a science if it's able to predict something. Well, that's controversial to say the least. It's just false. Because also in the natural sciences, you have the historical natural sciences, and they do not make predictions. They're very simple. The historical, so if you look at paleoceanography, for instance, that looks at, at the oceans 1 million, 5 million, 100 million years ago, they do not make predictions. They also make predictions, but they're not measured by their ability to make predictions. So this is just an exaggeration. But usually people have a very narrow view on the sciences and usually don't see the historical natural sciences. They are very important, the historical natural sciences, especially concerning climate, of course. Anyway, so what he then claims is that a theory in that sense, how it uses in science, is a complex intermixture of two elements. He says a language and a body of substantial hypotheses. A language, I mean, there are concepts, and with these concepts you can articulate then substantive hypotheses. And he says a language is a set of tautologies. That sounds probably strange when you read it. Tautologies in the language of the 50s are definitions. He just means definitions, and then it makes sense, right? That serve as a filing system, he says, exhaustive with heading and subheadings, similar to a taxonomy. What he means there, well, it's a system of concepts. The details are not really interesting at this point. And he says, for example, he says supply and demand. There are various factors are classified as affecting either supply or demand, for example, in final markets for consumer goods. And then you can say, okay, in this language where you say, okay, which factors are relevant for supply or demand. And he says that is not in all situations a useful distinctions. In a speculative market with short-term fluctuations, it doesn't make sense to sort the factors in that way. Okay. And then we have this language, and then we can articulate a body of substantive hypotheses intended to explain a certain class of phenomena. What you see here is that what Friedman does, he spoke about predictions before, and now he speaks about explanations. And that is something what I have seen quite often in economics, that economists don't really make a difference between predictions and explanations. And you must be aware that not every prediction is a potential explanation, right? If I make the prediction on some indicators that in 3 days from now it will be snowing, right? And I use a set of indicators, right? That may be a true prediction, but it may not be an explanation at all if I use indicators, symptoms, right? It's not an explanation, right? So, and also there are explanations that are not useful as predictions because they are post hoc explanations. So one should not identify predictions and explanations, but economists often do that, and sometimes I have the impression when one presses them, then they say, oh, no, not explanation, but only prediction, right? And then predictions in a very technical sense, something you can derive from a hypothesis. So a hypothesis is a good one when you can derive something about concrete affairs, and that doesn't have to, they don't have to be in the future, but you can derive something, and then you get as a derivation from the hypothesis, you get something that is then called a prediction, although it's not necessarily in the future. So anyway, so that's what he says here. The only relevant test for hypothesis, this is what he claims here, is the comparison of its prediction with experience. And he argues for that later. So he says, so if you want to determine the quality of a hypothesis in economics, the only way to determine this is by judging its, assessing its predictions. Predictions don't have to be about the future. I said that already. There may be retradictions, but they must not be known to the forecaster. So it must really follow from the hypothesis as something new. If there is one hypothesis consistent with the evidence, there are infinitely many others as well. So this is a very important point, and this is really amazing that Friedman writes that in 53. New evidence may rule out some of the competitors, but can never reduce them to a single one. Considerations of simplicity and fruitfulness may now come to play. Because what he sees here is, in philosophy of science, is called the thesis of the underdetermination of theory by data. And this is really amazing that he sees that in 53 already, because in standard philosophy of science, at that time, this was not seen. It was much earlier seen at the beginning of the 20th century, but it became a topic only then 20 years after Friedman's article. So the point is simply, if you have a number of data points and you construct a hypothesis that's compatible with it, then you can construct infinitely many different hypotheses. And if you then try to say, oh, I only want to have one, the true one, and you want to eliminate the hypothesis, and you say, okay, we need additional data to eliminate some of the hypotheses, then what Friedman says, rightly so, you never can eliminate all the hypotheses apart from one. You're always left with a number of hypotheses. So there is no way to determine one true hypothesis by data. And that's a very important insight in what he says then, and this is the standard thing how one speaks about today. Considerations of simplicity and fruitfulness come into play. So then you have different hypotheses, and then you say, which one do I take? And then it's the consideration, well, which one is the simplest one, and which one is the most fruitful one? And that's, of course, a complicated story, but he sees that very clearly. I was quite amazed that he sees that in 53 and expressed it perfectly right and correct. Okay. So the next step concerning positive economics is now that he says that in the social sciences there are no experiments designed to exclude disturbing influences. He called it controlled experiments, but this does not produce a categorical difference between them and the physical sciences because it's a matter of degree. So he says, look, this is 53, way decades before experimental economics was invented. And he says, yeah, we don't have that in the social sciences, but that's not a fundamental difference to the physical sciences. It's a matter of degree. This is what he claims. Because it does not prevent testing hypotheses by predictions, but the evidence is often more difficult to interpret. Weeding out of unsuccessful hypotheses is slow and difficult. So it's just more complicated in the social sciences, including economics, but it's not categorically different from how physics works. There are, what he claims, sometimes very clear cases of hypotheses, for instance, that the increase in the amount of money leads to an increase in prices, exemplified in all cases of inflation. You remember I mentioned that example already, that David Hume had it already in the 18th century. Increase amount of money, increase of prices, and of this Friedman claims that there are no counter instances for that this is always the case. Ceteris paribus. The difficulty of that testing of hypotheses in the social sciences and economics had two effects. This is what he says, and that has effects on how economics is practiced. The one is retreat into formal and tautological analysis. Tautological analysis are analysis of concepts. You just analyze what the concepts mean. Right? And formal, of course, you build formal models in order to articulate what you want to say, which are, he says, they are important, but economics is more. It must predict, not only describe the consequences of action. Not only predict the consequences of action, that's again the possible use in policy advice. So what he says is one of the consequences that, experimental work is so hard, you go to theoretical work, right? In theoretical work is conceptual analyses and is formal analyses, and there he says that's just not enough because we must have hypotheses that predict and not only describe the consequences of actions. So this is one of the effects. The second effect, he claims, is that people in economics often misunderstand the role of evidence in theoretical work. Evidence meaning data, empirical data, right? And the question is, what is the interplay between empirical data and theory in economics? And there he says people misunderstand that, and he says then there are two fundamental roles of the evidence. First, in construction of hypotheses. A hypothesis must be consistent with the existing evidence in order to be focused on the intended set of phenomena. right, which is plausible. So you have some sort of phenomena, say in the financial markets, and then if you construct a hypothesis, and then of course you use what you already know, the data you have, in the construction of this hypothesis. And then you try to derive from this hypothesis novel predictions, and these novel predictions you must again use evidence, empirical data, and look whether the data that are out there in the world, whether they are in accordance with the predictions of the hypothesis. So data have a role, a double role, which is not unambiguously defined. So if you have a certain empirical datum, it's not clear that you're going to use it only for the construction of a hypothesis, or if you use it for testing a hypothesis. So that role is not predetermined, but it's very important to see that evidence plays a role in both of these activities. The relation between A and B is that the distribution of facts between them is accidental. So, as I said, it's not clear when you have certain data about, say, about banks and what they do, and then it's not clear whether you use this data to construct a hypothesis or whether you use them in order to test a hypothesis. This is not clear. It's accidental how you do it. And the generation of new hypotheses, he says, does usually not start from scratch, but is result of a failed test of an earlier hypothesis. So you have an earlier hypothesis, you test it against the data, and then you see, whoops, that doesn't work, that is falsified, and then you start from there and generate a new hypothesis. Now he says in a further step, as a consequence of the difficulties of getting new relevant evidence is that it leads to the temptation to believe in other modes of hypothesis testing. Other modes meaning apart from prediction, testing the predictions, especially concerning their assumptions in contrast to their consequences. Right? You have the hypothesis, then you can derive consequences, and then you test the consequences, predictions, and then he says, Friedman says, wait, now people thought there's another way of testing hypothesis, namely we look what are the assumptions in such a hypothesis. Okay, example will follow. And there he says this is fundamentally misguided. You cannot test, and this is a fundamental part of Friedman's essay, where he says truly important and significant hypotheses will be found to have assumptions that are wildly inaccurate descriptive representations of reality. That's the first thing. So the assumptions are wildly inaccurate descriptive representations of reality. And in general, the more significant the theory, the more unrealistic the assumptions in this sense. This is a centerpiece of attack again. Well, this has been the target of criticisms of Friedman, and many economists and philosophers of economics have said the guy is out of his mind. Well, said it more politely, some of them at least. So he said, yeah, okay. In general, the more significant, the more unrealistic the assumptions, completely crazy. And then, in this sense, okay, in which sense? Anyway, we'll come back to that. Don't worry. So this is at least what he says. So the point was that you cannot test a theory by its assumptions. Why not? Well, because the assumptions are wildly inaccurate descriptive representations of reality. And those you cannot test on reality. Of course not. Yeah, you know they're false, right? Wildly inaccurate. So why is that so? A good hypothesis, he says, explains much by little. It abstracts the crucial elements from the mass of complex and detailed circumstances. It must therefore be false. So he said the centerpiece of hypothesis is something that is an abstraction, and therefore, as a description, it is of course false. If you abstract it, then you don't get the reality, but you get an abstract that's false. But that's, so to speak, the essence of hypotheses, that they do that. And this means that Friedman claims a very special kind of falsity of the assumptions embedded in significant hypotheses. He just does not say any sort of falsity is fine. He says this kind of falsity, and I'm coming back to that. And this is overlooked by many, many people. It's not just any damn falsity, but it's very special falsities Friedman is focusing on. And it is here, right? One has to read it. So, not the realism of the assumptions is important, that's what he said, but whether they are sufficiently good approximation for the given purpose. And this can only be found out by their predictions. So the falsity of the assumption is granted, right? And that's not the point, so you can't discuss it. You can't say, oh, I dislike this hypothesis because there's an assumption in it that's false. That's trivial, Friedman says. Of course they are false. They must be false. So don't judge the hypothesis by the falsity or veracity of the assumptions, but only by the predictions. And the question is, how he puts it, there must be sufficiently good approximations for the given purpose. So the assumptions are picked for a purpose, and for that purpose they must fit, implying for another purpose the same assumption may not fit, right? And details will follow. Okay. So thus, he says, two supposedly independent tests thus reduce to one test, namely the test by predictions and the test of assumptions. He says, test of assumptions only works by predictions. So this is not an independent thing. You can't say, okay, you test the assumptions, I test the predictions, and then we'll see how the hypothesis fares. Then Friedman says, nonsense. Is only one test possible, and the test is by the predictions, because the usefulness of the assumptions is tested by the predictions as well. They are false anyway, right? We know that they are false. So you can't test them by empirical data. What you've got to do is you put them in the hypothesis for a certain purpose, and then you test the hypothesis by the predictions that it makes. So this is his message here. And the examples are, for instance, that he uses, and that is, of course, from the 1940s and 50s. I don't know the details. And there he speaks about the theory of monopolistic and imperfect competition that was motivated by the perceived descriptive inaccuracy of neoclassical assumptions of perfect competition and perfect monopoly, not by failing predictions. So this theory of monopolistic imperfect competition was obviously an alternative to the assumptions that were made at the time of perfect competition and perfect monopoly. And the critics said, look, there is no perfect monopoly in the world. It's always imperfect. And there is no perfect monopoly. It's always imperfect. So we should, situations like that, we should analyze not in terms of these exaggerations of perfect competition and perfect monopoly. And he says that the criticism on these were not by failing predictions, but people said these assumptions are false, right? There is no perfect competition in the world, and therefore we hate the theory, right? And there Friedman says that's the wrong approach. Only look at the predictions. Or another one is, that's an interesting one to which I come back, the discussion of marginal analysis concentrated on the largely, he says, irrelevant question of whether businessmen in fact reach their decision by marginal analysis and not on the conformity to experience of the consequences of marginal analysis. So the point is people apparently in that time then asked whether really businessmen in firms calculated on the basis of marginal analysis how they should run the production. Right? And then people discuss that, and there Friedman says, look, that's not the real question. It's a wrong question. The question is another one, namely whether in fact then the firm produces effectively, right? Okay, we come back to that. The two examples exemplify the use of counterfactual assumptions in economic theory, and I discussed this specific kind of counterfactuality, really falseness, later in 2.4. It's more complicated than one sees here, and Friedman's analysis is really deficient because he mixes up two different cases, and I discuss them later. So what he says then, that economic theory should not be criticized for its deployment of such assumptions. What really counts is whether from such assumptions empirically correct implications follow. And this is his standard line, which people misunderstand in the sense that they think anything false is fine for an assumption as a theory, and this is not what Friedman says, right? It's not anything, it's very specific falsities. Okay, we'll come back to that. And this, in Friedman, then justifies a more extensive discussion of the methodological principle involved, and that comes in the next section.